Good morning. Welcome to the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey. I'm John Weingart. I'm Associate Director of the Institute, and I'm delighted to see so many people here, or at least know so many people here to hear about the perspective on the Friday morning after the election of 2022. At Eagleton, we've had an event the morning after the election day for many years, usually after each statewide primary and general election. And we did that in person with a live audience. And over the years, we've all noticed, but it's a little odd that as technology in general has improved, our ability to know who won the next morning has decreased. So we decided this year to put it off a few days, both so that we might have a little more perspective, small bit more perspective, and those who are part of this panel who have been tabulating data all week would have a little bit of a chance to get some sleep before being here today. Today is also Veterans Day, so celebrating and commemorating the 105th anniversary of the armistice that ended World War I, and we honor veterans past and present, and we also honor those people who are brave enough to run for office and campaign for people who are running for office and help make the system work better than it did before. We have a panel of experts from the Eagleton Institute who are going to each share their perspective with us, and then we'll have some questions from the audience and responses to those questions. You can go into the Q&A function on your screen and enter a question. We will not be able to get to them all, but we'll get to some. This program is being live streamed, so people can see it now, and it will be on the Eagleton Institute YouTube channel, so it will be viewable afterwards as well. In looking at all the news the last few days, I was struck by one comment on Wednesday morning. Terrence McDonald in the New Jersey Monitor wrote, "This feels like the third post-election day in 6 years where those of us who think we know what's going to happen are exposed as knowing basically nothing." Then he said, "Can't wait to forget this lesson 2 years from now." So here we are, and we have our panel includes Kelly Dittmar, who's an associate professor of politics at Rutgers University in Camden, and also a senior scholar at the Eagleton Center on American Women and Politics. Chris Shields is assistant research professor and historian with the Eagleton Center on the American Governor. Ashley Koning is an assistant research professor and the director of the Eagleton Center on Public Interest Polling. Elizabeth Matto is a research professor and director of the Center for Youth Political Participation at Eagleton. And Saladin Ambar is professor of political science and senior scholar with the Center on the American Governor. So why don't we start with Kelly and some of your thoughts about what's happened and what we know so far.
Sure. Thanks, John, and thanks to everyone at Eagleton for organizing this, bearing with all of us who've not been paying much attention to anything logistics other than results in the last couple of days, but we made it here. And I also just want to start quickly and say a big thanks to our team at the Center for American Women in Politics. All the numbers and takeaways I'm going to point out to you are very much thanks to a team of people who stayed up all night, have been working all days to try to figure out where women landed or will land in this election. And so that's what I'll focus on, just highlighting a couple of the key top lines for women and what we're watching for, obviously, as the results continue to come in. So I want to start by just noting, obviously, those who've been following along know that 2018 and 2020 were both record years for women, both running and winning across levels of office. And so one of the questions going into 2022 was, would we see that continued pace of change continued to be a record year again in terms of candidacies and outcomes? We did see some records in terms of candidacies and nominations for women, but not nearly across the board and not nearly as large. And so when it came to results, it's not terribly surprising that apart from the gubernatorial level, which I'll talk about in a second, women are largely looking at a more stasis year. So when we look at congressional numbers and outcomes, as we look at state legislative numbers, which obviously are still not all in, we think that the numbers will be more on par with where they are as of today, as of election day, than new record highs or large new record highs. We have a tracker up on our website, which makes it easy for you to compare those counts in terms of the current level of elected women and records for each level of office by party, by race and ethnicity. And so you can find that at cawp.rutgers.edu. And there's a link from our main page to that tracker. If we look, as I mentioned before, at the one level of office where we really saw these notable gains for women, that was at the gubernatorial level. Women have, the record high for women governors has been 9 for almost 2 decades. We first set that record in 2004. After this cycle is complete and going into 2023, we will have 12 women governors, a record number of 25 nominees, but 12 women governors serving. And those will include some firsts. The first woman governor, for example, of Arkansas, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, is one of 2 new women governors, or 3 new women governors elected so far. Tina Kotek and Maura Healey, 2 other new women governors who will be the first openly lesbian governors in the country. So notable gain to 12 at the gubernatorial level, but just a reminder, that's 24%. Women are over 50% of the population. So as we always want to remind folks, we've got a lot of work to do to continue to work towards gender parity at that highest level of state government. If we look at the congressional contests, in the Senate, it looks like we could match the record high of women in the Senate, which would be 26. And that will depend on how races break in Nevada, where Catherine Cortez Masto is obviously in a tight contest, as well as in Alaska, where we know it will be a Republican woman. We just don't know which Republican woman will win that race. And then notable there, we have one new woman, Senator Katie Britt in Alabama. She's a Republican. And just a reminder that embarrassingly, we will have no Black women in the Senate again going into 2023. And if Catherine Cortez Masto is defeated, we will also have no Latinas in the U.S. Senate. And so these are reminders that even where we see gains for women, we have to look as well at the diversity of women and overall representativeness of our elected bodies and among the women we elect. In the House, we have about 18 women in races too close to call. So it's hard for us to know, actually. We're that close that we don't know where we'll land, but we could meet our current number of 123 women. We're about 11 away from that now. That's also the current record. But we could also fall short by a couple, depending on how these races break out. So we're watching those very closely. There are 19 new women already elected, 13 Democrats and 6 Republicans. That's not a record. Again, we elected more new women in 2018 and 2020, but still notable among them that we've elected, for example, the first woman to Congress from Vermont. Vermont was the last state to have no women in Congress. The first Latinas from Colorado and Illinois, the first Black woman to ever serve in Congress from Pennsylvania, Summer Lee. And so we have made and crossed some milestones, even if we don't hit a new record for women in the House. Finally, it looks like we know we will have a record number of Black women in Congress and in the House, though by 1, so 26 up from 25. And we're also likely to have a record number of Latinas again in the House and in Congress overall, but we're waiting for some of these too close to call races to see if that ultimately bears out. And then we've had 9 women incumbents defeated in this cycle. So as we look to the final counts in the House, partly why we have these gains, but also we might not reach a new record is because of the defeats of some of our incumbent women. Our state legislative results will be posted later today, our initial results, but we do have a lot, again, of races hundreds of races, still too close to call there. So we won't be able to say whether or not we're going to hit records or not at this point, but we will be able to start to parse out where we've seen gains, especially in some specific states, which look promising. Based on my first analysis this morning, there's at least, I think, 18 states where we already know we have gains. Though, again, it looks like they're probably not as large as we've seen in recent elections. And then we'll also be able to point out states where we may see a drop in the number of women serving. So I will stop there, but thanks again for giving the space to talk through this, and happy to talk any more about any specific levels of office or women that we were tracking this cycle.
Thank you very much, Kelly, and we'll come back for questions that we all have for each other, as well as questions people watching may have. Next, Chris Shields.
Thanks, John. Good morning, and thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning in such a busy week. Hopefully, everyone looking forward to getting some sleep this weekend to recover. Gubernatorial elections are always interesting in a midterm year because the governor's races tend to get overshadowed a little bit by, who's going to control the Senate, who's going to control the House. But the midterm year is when there are always the most gubernatorial races that are happening. This year, there were 36 gubernatorial races taking place on Tuesday night. So it's a really important time for governor's races, and important that we don't forget them because they are so important, remembering to pay attention to state level politics. There were a few storylines on Tuesday night that I thought were really interesting, and I thought maybe I would just go through a couple of those. As Kelly mentioned, we'll have a new record for the number of women governors of 12 once all of these new governors are inaugurated. The only thing I'll add to that is that going into Tuesday night, there were 9 women serving as governor of U.S. states, which had tied the previous record. 8 were running for re-election on Tuesday night. So there were 8 incumbent women running for re-election on Tuesday night, and all 8 won. The one other was Kate Brown in Oregon, who was term limited. So she was leaving. And then there will be 4 first-time women governors who will be joining those 8 to make the 12. And as Kelly mentioned, that's Tina Kotek in Oregon, Maura Healey in Massachusetts, who will also be the first out lesbian governors in U.S. history. Then Sarah Huckabee Sanders in Arkansas, and then whoever wins in Arizona. We don't have a result in Arizona yet, but it'll be either Katie Hobbs or Carrie Lake who will be number 12 in terms of the women serving as governor. In addition to that, Wes Moore in Maryland is interesting. He will be the first Black governor in the history of Maryland, and in fact, only the 3rd state to elect a Black governor in U.S. history. Wes Moore himself is very interesting. He's a Rhodes Scholar. He's an author. He does not have a lot of political experience, but I think is someone to keep an eye on in terms of looking into the future and his political future. I don't want to be the one who starts to bring up future races when we're still talking about 2022, but so I'll leave it at that. But I think he's a really interesting candidate and has a future. It's still he will be the only Black governor in the United States once he's inaugurated with this new slate of governors, and it is still the case that no state in U.S. history has elected a Black woman as governor. So clearly a whole lot of work left to be done there. There were 3 Black women running on Tuesday night. The most well-known, of course, being Stacey Abrams in Georgia, who was running in a rematch with the incumbent Brian Kemp in a race that she lost. In terms of party, the Democrats will pick up at least 1 gubernatorial seat in this cycle. It could be, it could be as many as 3. Possibly 2. There's still 2 races left to be called, one in Nevada. Actually, technically 3 races left to be called in Nevada, Alaska, and Arizona, although it's pretty clear what's going to happen ultimately in Alaska. Excuse me. Then the last thing that I'll bring up for now that I think is really interesting in this cycle, we talked a lot, and I'm sure, Ashley will be talking about polling. We'll talk a lot about, John mentioned, experts being wrong once again going into this race, which is, I think, largely true. But one of the really interesting places where I think that's true with the gubernatorial races is there was a lot of talk going into this cycle about incumbency and incumbency advantage amongst governors, which has traditionally, historically been really strong. Incumbent governors win in recent years at over an 80% rate. So it's a really strong advantage to be an incumbent in a gubernatorial race. And there was some sense that this year that might be different. That there were a lot of factors this year. For one thing, all of these governors were elected in 2018. So these were the governors who were governors of their state during the pandemic from the very beginning to the very present day. And I think there was some sense that some of the unpopular things that governors had to do in order to mitigate COVID and the amount of time that COVID lasted was going to really hurt some of these incumbents. There was a sense that 2018, which of course was the midterm election of Donald Trump's presidency, was a very different political context than 2020, which was the midterm election of Joe Biden's first term. So I think that there was some sense that this was going to be a much more difficult year for incumbent governors. That turned out to be completely wrong. There were 28 governors running for re-election this year. 26 of them have been called as winners. One is that's left is Mike Dunleavy in Alaska, who will win. That just takes some time because they use ranked choice voting in Alaska. So that'll be 27 out of 28. That leaves just Nevada. And whether Steve Sisolak can make up the difference and win, or if it'll be 27-1 in favor of incumbents. That combined with the last 2 years, in 2020, incumbents went 9 for 9. Last year, Phil Murphy was the only incumbent running and he won. So it's been in the past 3 years, quick math, that's like 36, 37 and 1 in favor of incumbent governors. So if anything, the incumbency advantage for governors is just getting stronger, which I thought was sort of an interesting take from Tuesday night. There are a few more storylines from Tuesday night, but I think I'll stop there from now because there's a chance you might want to hear about races other than gubernatorial races this morning. So we can come back to some of those others and maybe looking ahead. But those were some of the things that happened in the gubernatorial races on Tuesday night. John?
Okay, thank you very much. So the bottom line is if somebody wants to be a governor, you should get to be a governor first. Next, everybody's favorite topic in the last many cycles is public interest, is polling. And Ashley Koning.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. So the good news is pollsters get to keep their jobs. I'm especially happy about that, but it was definitely a good night for pollsters after a few interesting election cycles. And so let's kind of rewind a little bit to 2016 and go through how polling has operated in the past couple cycles. And even before that, just to kind of set the stage about the challenges that pollsters have faced over the past several years. I always like to use the word unprecedented with the past few election cycles because so much of it has been. And especially this comes down to polling. And I'm sure all of you feel like you hear about polling everywhere all the time. And you probably have even been contacted in some fashion by pre-election polls and campaign pollsters leading up to this election cycle in particular. So let's kind of break it down a little bit. And so, we obviously are facing some challenges in the industry. There is obviously less people who are answering their phones. We have a majority of wireless only households in the country, as well as within New Jersey, especially households with children in them. We have, decreasing landlines, people not picking up caller ID, spam calls that are absolutely obliterating the industry. And so we're into response rates, those who actually complete an interview from the pool of those contacted, we're down to about low single digits across the industry on average. And this got even lower after 2016, and I'm sure people can hypothesize why that happened. And so it's become a very difficult climate to be conducting public opinion polls. What makes it even trickier is when we're talking about pre-election polls, we are predicting, and I hate to use that word predict when talking about polling because it's not something we should be doing, but we are trying to think of who is going to turn out to vote, which is a population we really know very little about. It's an unknown population. We can't base it on a past election cycle. We can't put in a secret sauce or formula into polling that makes us know exactly who's going to turn out to vote. A voter can say they won't and they do. A voter can say they will and they don't. And so it becomes a really difficult task to do so. Polling is also incredibly expensive, given what I said previously about people not answering the phones means we have to call more people. And so it becomes very difficult to do polling. And so that has meant a couple of different things. It's meant a decrease in the polls that we see, especially among credible, reputable pollsters. And we have seen, especially, we can talk a little bit about this for this particular cycle, we have seen an influx of for lack of a better word, perhaps either more junk polling or, not to conflate it with junk polling, but more partisan and internal campaign polling, which is kind of a different beast of polling than those who are traditional pollsters and do internal polling. And so we've definitely seen an influx of that, or we've seen a drought of polling in many battleground states throughout the past couple cycles as well. And so, a decrease in the credibility of polls or credible pollsters and a decrease in the frequency of polls obviously makes it difficult to really mirror results when we have things like late deciders and, voters switching sides in the final days and weeks. So 2016, we had a problem with not capturing the non-college educated, particularly white male vote. Pollsters tried to rectify that in 2018, which we actually saw the polls do pretty well in the 2018 midterms. 2016 and 2020, we saw errors that were in favor of Democrats. Even though Biden won, it was not by the huge landslide that had been thought according to polling. And that takes us here to 2022, where we're actually seeing a decent night for polls, like I said, and actually perhaps even a bias in the Republican direction. And I think, and we can unpack this as we continue, we have to kind of understand the under the hood of polls and the transparency of polls. We saw a lot of the big races around the country, like in Georgia, in Nevada, in Arizona, as of the vote counts right now, actually polls underestimating the Democratic candidates. And so I think we need to look more at how to interpret polls, how to understand polls better, and maybe not get caught up too much in the vibes and the mood that's in the 24/7 news cycle. And instead think about, actually looking at the numbers. While these numbers are survey estimates, and I say estimates precisely because they are, and they're based on statistics, we should embrace the uncertainty that comes with polling and understand its underpinnings. But at the same time, it's kind of the best tool that we have to understand systematically and quantitatively where the race might be. And even better yet, not using them to predict, but really rather using them to understand the how and the why, which the exit polls are certainly helping us do as we hopefully someday soon come to a close with this particular cycle.
Thank you, Ashley. Next, Elizabeth Matto.
Thank you, John. It's really nice to be here with my colleagues today as we do this collective debrief and sift through the outcomes and sort of the repercussions of Election Day 2022. I want to share a few thoughts or what I've been looking for when I'm looking at the youth vote, not just this year, but what it what it predicts for future elections. It's worth reminding everyone at the outset, we hear a lot about the millennial generation, Generation Z. Maybe start by just providing a little context and maybe some definitions of what we mean by what's a millennial and what's Gen Z. When we're talking about the youth vote, typically, we're talking about voters 18 to 29 years old. And that really captures sort of a mixture really of the youngest millennials and older Gen Z voters. Millennials are typically characterized as those born between 1981, 1996, so those about 26 to 41 years old. Gen Z is typically characterized as those born between 1997 and 2012. So that can go from 10 to 25 years old. So certainly setting the marking points of beginning and ends of generations is a mixture of art and science, but it's a nice way of trying to help us understand, explain political behavior, and in particular, voting behavior. It's also worth noting there are a lot of unique and meaningful traits among young adults today and young voters. One of the first one that comes to mind is just the size. There are a lot of young adults out there and young voters. And so what I'm often telling my students is if young adults vote in large numbers and consistently, really stand to make an impact on elections now and in the future. Young adults today, younger cohorts today are the most racially ethnically diverse generations in American history. At this stage of their lives have more education than previous generations did at this stage of their lives. And I think young adults today facing really unique challenges. And whether that is climate change, gun violence in schools, or COVID and the after effects of remote instruction. So, it's a generation, young adults deserve a seat at the table, have a political voice that needs to be heard, but also needs to be expressed. So what I really was focused on this election and most elections, but this election in particular, really looking at three things as I'm trying to sift through the results. First of all, wondering, have young adults in their voter turnout behavior this year continued the upward trajectory that we've been seeing in voting rates? Was one thing I was looking for. Another was, were young adults, or was the youth vote making a difference? Was it making an impact? And then the third was, are we starting to see representation among young adults when it comes to elected office? And I would say there's a positive story to tell on all three fronts. And I'll start with turnout. In many ways, 2016 was really a turning point for the youth vote in the United States, and really was a spark. It was in 2016, the 2016 election, that really sparked a steady increase in turnout rates among young adults, both in midterm elections, but also in general elections. It's worth noting a few things. Worth noting that no matter what the age group, turnout rates there's a big difference in turnout rates when it comes to general elections, presidential elections, and midterm elections. But there was great concern about youth voter turnout rates in midterm elections prior to 2016. So for example, in 2010 and 2014, we know that barely 20% of eligible young voters turned out for the midterms. In New Jersey, it was particularly low in 2014 and stood at 11%. But we have seen steady, we saw a dramatic increase in voter turnout in 2018 among young voters. We saw it go, spike all the way up to 31%, which again, considering that it hovered nationally at about 20%, that was notable. So certainly when looking at this year, we wanted to get a sense of have those rates stayed steady? And so far, the numbers are suggesting that they have. Right now, estimates are that youth voter turnout for this midterm was about 28 percentage points. Again, it's worth noting these numbers will change, they will shift, but I take that as a positive sign. I think it's really worth emphasizing here too, and we can talk about this further, some real significant challenges, obstacles that are uniquely felt by young adults when it comes to accessing the ballot. One of those being there have been so many changes to registration and electoral practices, not just in New Jersey, but nationally. And if you're someone who travels frequently or moves frequently, if you're someone without much of a voting history, those barriers weigh pretty heavily. So certainly I'm pleased by initial results that we're seeing about youth voter turnout rates for this midterm. The next question really is, did the youth vote make a difference? And again, often telling our students, you want campaigns, you want parties to worry about not reaching out to you as a cohort. And that takes voting in significant numbers and consistently and making a difference. I think as youth turnout rates have increased in recent elections, we've also seen a more steady support for Democratic candidates among young adults. I would say, I think we always knew young adults were ideologically, although not a monolith, and they're a mixture, tended to, we've certainly supported progressive candidates. We're certainly seeing more and more alignment and support and loyalty, I would say, to Democratic candidates among young voters. And to a large extent, youth voters were supporting Democratic candidates far more than Republican candidates in national races. And one thing that's particularly interesting is that support was even more pronounced in some really pivotal races. So races such as the Fetterman race in Pennsylvania, races in Wisconsin and Michigan. It was that strong, dramatic support for Democratic candidates that may have really helped, and affected the outcome of those races, with many even arguing that, the youth vote played a significant role in limiting the expected red wave. Even got a shout out for President Biden this week from the East Room. So, I think that enhances the likelihood that in future elections, campaigns and parties will really work to mobilize young adults. And then the last thing I'll mention is, are we seeing young adults being represented? Although we know that at the highest levels of government, baby boomers continue to dominate the composition of the House of Representatives and the Senate, we saw some small but meaningful advances among young adults running for office and winning. As Kelly mentioned earlier, with the election of Katie Britt, the election of Katie Britt from Alabama, Republican senator, the Senate now has 2 millennials serving in office. In addition to the newly elected Senator Katie Britt, Senator John Ossoff from Georgia is the other millennial serving in the Senate. And something else that was particularly notable and is exciting was the election of the first Generation Z member of the House of Representatives, with the election of Maxwell Alejandro Frost from U.S. District 10 from Florida. And it's only fitting that he's the first Generation Z member of the House because he really came out of the March for Our Lives movement. He served as the national organizing director of the March for Our Lives movement. And for many of us who pay attention to the youth vote and youth political participation, it was really the March for Our Lives movement that was a harbinger of youth political participation. So it seems only fitting that he's the first Gen Z member of the House. So there's plenty more to discuss that I'm happy to discuss afterwards, but thank you all for having me. Nice to be here.
Thank you, Elizabeth. The last member of our august panel, Saladin Ambar.
Thank you, John. It's good to be with you here today. I think, like most everyone, I anticipated that, given our knowledge of American political history, that Republicans would regain the House and quite possibly regain the Senate. But I was bothered by, perhaps you were too, a stubborn question. And the question was, can you do that? Can you do that? Can you take a right-of-way that has been emblazoned essentially through precedent in American law, the right of women to have control over their reproduction and their own bodies, their reproductive health? Can you do that? Can you take that right away, a 50-year right, without political consequences? Another aspect of that was the question of, can you engage in an insurrection and or support it and or belittle it on the nation's capital and do so without political consequence? Can you do that? Another question that stuck in my mind was, now that we are well over 1 million deaths in the COVID era, can you belittle or diminish or kind of look away from an immense national health crisis and deny its existence without political consequence? Those were some of the stubborn questions on my mind. Can you do that, though, was at the fore. And it turns out that the Dobbs decision and threats to democracy were huge impediments to the continuation of politics as usual, where the out of power party gained seats in the House and Senate, and usually quite significantly. And I certainly don't envy my colleague Ashley's job right now, because it's hard to capture this place we're in American politics through polling. This is the first major election in a post-Roe, hopefully post-insurrection America. And frankly, redistricting and voter suppression efforts have masked, I think, real weaknesses within the Republican Party. But I challenge myself to think about where we have been like this in American life. And I go back to 1966, the first midterm elections after the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That was the election that produced 10 flipped gubernatorial seats by Republicans. They netted 8 out of that. Ronald Reagan emerged out of that cadre of Republican governors. This was a moment of tremendous backlash to the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act among white Southerners. And the question then was, can you do that? And Lyndon Johnson understood, in his estimation, you could not do that without political cost. For Johnson, he was willing to push forward a Civil Rights Act and a Voting Rights Act, but understood that it would cost Democratic votes in the South for the foreseeable future. And that backlash, I think, is important because it is, I think, somewhat suggestive of the moment we're in now, where people, a number of people, in the former case of the 66 period, a number of, frankly, white Southerners felt, and perhaps throughout the country felt, that they were losing their lock on political determinism in American life and felt threatened by it. And that led to a huge transformation. You know, the era, you know, people my age grew up in, understood it because we were seeing something on the order of, I guess it was, 5 of 6 presidential elections from 68 to 88 won by Republicans. And it was not until Bill Clinton, a transitional figure, came along that stemmed that tide. And we're now living in an era where 7 of the 8 past presidential elections have led to Democratic wins in the popular vote, although Republicans have won 3 of those elections through the Electoral College. I guess what I'm suggesting is we're in a tremendous period of political destabilization. And the fact of the matter is that we had to answer, at least tentatively, at least initially in this election as a country, whether or not the normalization of violence would be the route we would take, or we would somehow find a way to normalize multiracial democracy in our own way, understanding that the demographic changes taking place were not going to mean that we had to have losers and winners, but that we could theoretically, as a nation, win altogether. And I think about this in terms of our, movement forward as a country and as a collective body. Lincoln, at the end of the second inaugural address, he says 2 things. He says, with malice toward none, with charity for all. With malice toward none is where we are. It's nice to celebrate tolerance. And we've proven that maybe we can shun the normalization of violence, at least temporarily. That's where we are, with malice toward none, hopefully. But where we need to move forward to is with charity for all. We need to learn how to love and be together as a single coherent body politic, or this will just be, just one exaltation moment in a moment that may lead to other more negative outcomes in the future. And that's certainly, I think, a direction voters, at least in this election, said they're not happy to go into moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you all very much. And for those watching and meeting these people for the first time, the Eagleton Institute of Politics has many stars, these among them, and you go to the Eagleton webpage and find bios of these speakers and other people, faculty and staff and visiting associates at the Eagleton Institute. I wanted to pick up on one sort of the end of what you were saying, Dean. It would seem to me that this was a year when third parties could have been significant because there was apparently or thought to be significant displeasure with the Democratic and Republican parties for vastly different reasons. And I don't think there are any races where a third-party candidate ended up being decisive. I think that the one that got the most attention was the Senate race in Utah, where Mike Lee, senator, was victorious over Evan McMullin. I don't know if there are others where third party was a significant factor for an independent candidate. Anybody?
I think only to the degree that the Georgia runoff may not have been possible without the third party candidate in that race. But no, I agree. I don't see any other any evidence of third party candidates breaking through in any meaningful way.
There was as well in the 3-way gubernatorial race in Oregon included a former Democrat running as an independent. I think we have to be careful about how much we put into stake of that being a third party, in the sense that the loyalty to her in large part was based on a long history of being aligned with the party. But I think she ended up, Chris might be able to check me, with about 8% of the vote. And so it's unclear, in part because they didn't do exit polls in Oregon, to know exactly who she might have been taking votes away from. But ultimately, obviously, Tina Kotek, the Democrat, won. And so what I think was presumed as taking away votes from Kotek, if it did, still didn't change the predicted outcome of that race.
Yeah, I think that's right, Kelly. She ended up, I think, just under 9%. Of the vote, which I think was a little bit below where she had been polling, which happens sometimes with candidates when the race is expected to be close and people get a little bit concerned about voting for the third party candidate because they want to make sure that the candidate they don't want to win benefits from that. I would say in that Oregon race, the one thing the one pretty significant and clear impact that Betsy Johnson had on the race, the independent candidate, was in fundraising. She raised a lot of money, much of it from Phil Knight. But the extent to which that might have made it harder for Tina Kotek to fundraise, I don't know. But that certainly was out there in terms of one effect that a third party can have or an independent candidate can have on a race.
One of the questions coming in is concerns polling, and with the basically just the question being, given the increasing problems with polling, one might ask why continue to do it. What would be the effect on political electoral processes if it weren't done, or if it were suspended for 60 days before election day? How do you don't have to defend the whole craft, but how do you see it actually benefiting or affecting elections?
Yeah, I think there's a couple different things. I think it goes back to what I was saying about the mood and the vibes. I mean, I think it's better than the alternative of having just a vibey news cycle. I think it gives us some kind of quantitative basis. The whole point of scientific modern day polling is that we are trying to get a systematic read of the public from a sample. Now, because we're doing it from a sample, that means there's going to be some inherent error in it, a plus or minus that margin of error that we always talk about. And so I think if we relay that better, and I think if the media interpret that better, I think it would go a long way into understanding what pre-election polling is and is not. I don't know. Obviously, like I said, some of the traditional pollsters this year, as opposed to the internal pollsters who swung it for the GOP in the end in the polls, a lot of the traditional pollsters did very well. The good news is, despite the low response rates, we certainly still see the people who are responding to surveys are pretty on par with the people who are not. There is a little bit of concern over that when it comes to Trump supporters, and that is being actively studied in the discipline right now. But I still think it's a valuable asset, because without it, we don't know how people systematically feel on a lot of these issues. And I like to do public opinion polling because I think we know the population we're talking to. Like I said, pre-election polling is incredibly difficult and sometimes impossible because we simply don't know who's going to turn out. And if we stop treating it like the horse race and stop treating it as these numbers are, the gospel, do or die, and understand that there is variance and that there are a range of possibilities and scenarios, and understand that it really should be used for understanding the how and why, and not who's ahead and who is behind, I think we would go a long way into, understanding polling better, and also treating polling better and utilizing it better when it comes to election cycles.
What do any of you hope we will learn from exit polling or polling, post-election polling, about why people did what they did? Expectations or hopes in that regard?
Ashley, maybe I can add to the question for you, because we obviously, and I think this is also in possible questions, are looking at particularly gender and racial differences in exit polling, and spent some time with both the VoteCast, AP VoteCast survey, and the Edison exit poll yesterday, and found very, very different numbers. And we know that things will change in the coming days as they reweight and replay with those. But I think that's also a question for us to navigate, and maybe Ashley can shed some light on kind of what do we trust most in looking at, obviously, differences now in trying to attempt an exit poll to help us explain what happened on Tuesday. Because if we were to tell you, for example, what the gender gap was by group, it could be anywhere from 3 to 12 points in a state based on which exit poll we use for the same exact race. And so I would just say from COP's perspective, we're not putting anything out yet because we want to figure out what the best data is, but I'd be curious what Ashley's thought is on how to best interpret these.
Yeah, I would say first and foremost to let the dust settle. We obviously, these exit polls, and that's what drives pollsters crazy, that the news starts talking about them at 5 p.m. These exit polls get weighted to the final vote counts. And so if we don't have final vote counts and the numbers are going to keep changing until then, what is the point of analyzing the exit polls until all of this is well and done? They're still incredibly valuable. For those of you who don't know, the company is right here in the heart of New Jersey in Somerville. So that's a bit of New Jersey pride who conducts the exit polls. But really they are to be the retrospective of what happened in the election, not to tell us in the heat of the moment as numbers and vote counts keep changing. Now AP VoteCast came in because there was a split in the media outlets of who is using the traditional exit polling methods and who is now going to AP VoteCast. And so they have different methodologies. So like I would say with any polling, it's kind of looking under the hood of, how these different exit polls are conducted. Edison in particular, Edison Research, they use, they send people out to polling stations. They have people do it through, in person, through iPad, through a variety of reasons or methods that has changed, obviously, throughout the course of the pandemic. But I would say it really depends upon the different methodologies. And that's why it's so important to go back to the larger point of looking at the methodologies of polls and making sure that, whoever is doing them is a credible source and trying to be a better poll consumer. And again, that getting us a long way into understanding what the data mean, simply because, there are a lot of junk polls out there or polls with reasons other than, objectivity that I think can kind of skew what we're looking at with the polls. And not saying that necessarily applies to either exit poll, an endeavor, but just to kind of like always make sure we're looking under the hood.
John, can I add one thing on that point? It's the looking under the hood idea. I think one thing that will be interesting to me when I'm thinking about the youth vote, we know going into this election, and much of it from data from the Center for Public Interest Polling, that the economy and abortion, reproductive rights were particularly interesting and important to young adults. And again, it's worth mentioning that, young adults are certainly not a monolith. They don't all think the same, but at least at this point, this generation does tend to lean more democratic, more progressive. So I'll be interested to see not only that, how much that drove the vote, but then looking under the hood bit, what were the election day practices, registration practices in those states? We know from 2020, a point of pride for New Jersey again is that in 2020, New Jersey had the highest rates of voter turnout for young adults. 18 to 29-year-olds in New Jersey voted highest rates across the country for many reasons, but one of the pivotal reasons was the manner in which we held our election in 2020. Every registered voter got a ballot in the mail, whether they requested it or not. And that really helped and benefited not just, all sorts of voters, but young adults in particular. So the reasons, the issues that drive voters are really important that we can gather from reliable exit polls, but also the ways in which elections were held is also really an important element to look at.
I want to bring up redistricting and see what thoughts any of you have. That this year, and at least I think for the past several cycles, there's been a lot of advance focus and angst among some people about redistricting and how, particularly for this year, it was seen that Republicans were being successful in carving out districts in a number of states where it was going to make it virtually impossible, or at least very difficult, for Democrats to win. And my impression is so far that occurred in some places, but not in others. I don't know what you thought, but Kelly?
Yeah, I could speak to, we were trying to look at this obviously from a perspective of specifically how it would affect women House incumbents. And I think post-election we'll be able to also say more and can say some initially about how it's affecting where we got new women thanks to new districts. But I think going in, there was certainly a question as well with the partisan gerrymandering, would it then disproportionately impact women who are disproportionately Democrats? And so we were watching that throughout the cycle, and we actually have a redistricting effects tracker as well on our website to look at specific changes in districts for incumbent women. And I would just say at the end of the day, I haven't done the math, but I think it's about an even break. In other words, we saw women who lost both in primaries and in the general election, in part because of the makeup of their district. So somebody like Carolyn Maloney, who had to go up against another incumbent, Marie Newman in Illinois, and that story has more to it in terms of who drew the maps and who had a say. Yvette Harrell, a Republican in New Mexico. Carolyn Bordeaux, who also had to run against an incumbent. So what we saw was a lot of where it happened worse for women were where they had to compete against other incumbents. But then we had women who were safer, who ultimately were drawn into safer districts and really were kind of salvaged by the maps. I will say that one of those women who we thought was safer was somebody like Lauren Boebert, and that race is incredibly tight. So going back to some of the forecasts of these new districts, even for those who were drawing the maps, were obviously a bit off as well, based on just, ultimately what voters were going to do this cycle. So I think in our world, there was a bit of a wash in terms of how it may have fared in terms of disproportionate gender effects. But I know there's more to say on party generally.
The one change in the New Jersey congressional delegation owes something to redistricting, and that was Tom Kean Jr. defeating Tom Malinowski, the two-term incumbent, with redrawn districts that were more favorable. That district became more favorable to a Republican candidate. I don't know. There's no clear method of how you evaluate a redistricting plan to say, was it fair or not? It's often more clear if it's unfair, but not what the criteria are to be fair. But I was looking at numbers for New Jersey of Tom Kean won pretty decisively over Tom Malinowski, but if you took the three districts in New Jersey with relatively new Democratic incumbents and added their votes together, there were many more Democratic votes than Republican votes, something like 410,000 to 357,000. So if you had perfect vision as a Democrat, you could have drawn those lines differently so that Democrats won all three of them, but that's part of what happens with redistricting, I guess. Go ahead.
I think one other interesting place to look at this, John, is New York, where one way to think about this, from a gubernatorial standpoint, right, is looking at statewide races versus, say, the House races. And in a state like New York, where Kathy Hochul won by, I think, 5 or 6 points is where it looks like she's going to be, which is maybe a little bit closer than you would think a New York gubernatorial would be, but not by that much. But meanwhile, at the same time, the Republicans did well in New York in a lot of the House races. So that may be a place where you wonder at least whether the legislative map made a difference, comparing those House races to the statewide races.
And I would add to that, of course, we have to do a lot more digging now on what it meant for state legislatures. So we see state legislative flips in Michigan, Minnesota, Pennsylvania. And so I don't know the answer yet about the degree to which new lines help that, or some of the forces that Dean was talking about. I think it certainly played a role. And to Chris's point, some of the statewide races pulling up some of these state legislative candidates in those states, I think was also part of that equation. But redistricting is part of the conversation for sure at the state legislative level. But I think that's in the weeds of numbers we all now have to crunch post-election.
Does anyone know of other noteworthy results in New Jersey? Noteworthy is the wrong word, but changes or that was the only House one. But
I think just in terms of redistricting, Mikey Sherrill would have been a vulnerable race, but because of the new map, she was in a much safer place going into this election. So for us, that was a race we had been watching in terms of the maps.
And I would also add to that, looking at Gottheimer and Kim, all three of them had a flood of money come in the final weeks because of, the unnerving nature for Democrats, thinking that they could all three be vulnerable after having, come in on the blue wave and come into, like Kelly had mentioned, arguably Republican districts before then. So, I think unfortunately the 7th was somewhat of a sacrifice to pad the 3rd and the 5th and the 11th to make them bluer.
May I just jump in about Tom Kean Jr. and also I think Brian Kemp, I think, obviously these are different kinds of elections, but I do think it suggests something about the kinds of Republican candidates who were able to, push through, who were not so strictly or closely identified with either Donald Trump and certainly not some of the, implications of the January 6th insurrection, et cetera. I think these were candidates who were able to suggest, hey, I'm moderate. I may have very conservative views, but on issues of democracy, I'm related to democracy. I'm someone that's going to uphold the Constitution, and that's no small thing. And I think where Republican voters were looking to vote for Republicans, they found those more often than not in those kinds of more traditional candidates.
That's very interesting. And I think if the Republicans control the House of Representatives by a narrow margin, which seems like the most likely or among the most likely outcomes at the moment, it will be interesting to see whether Tom Kean Jr. and if there are several other moderates, they could have a large influence over what happens with the Congress going forward.
I would add to Dean's point that it also speaks to the strategy that many were skeptical about in terms of Democrats supporting extreme Republicans and trying to help them win primaries. And there was much kind of boo-hooing of it, of like, this is risky, this is bad, Democrats and ultimately, when you look across the races, I don't have a total count, but I think in most of the cases, if not all of them, that strategy worked. And Democrats ultimately came out. There's a race in Washington, for example, a House race with where Jamie Herrera Butler was defeated in the primary by a MAGA Republican who now looks like he's going to lose a seat that should have been a fairly safe Republican seat. And so, there are cases like this where I think that follows true to the kinds of candidates that were able to be elected.
I think for gubernatorial races, and I want to be clear that I'm stealing this statistic, that I didn't create it myself, but I believe there were 7 gubernatorial candidates who at some point questioned the results of the 2020 election. 6 of them have lost. The 7th, of course, is Carrie Lake, who's maybe the most prominent of the 7 and the most closely aligned with Donald Trump of the 7. That race, of course, is still to be determined. But on the whole, it looked like an argument that might have been effective in the Republican primaries was certainly less effective in the general election at the gubernatorial level, at any rate.
So if that's true for the Democratic strategy being successful in getting the most extreme Republican nominated, it just leaves behind the ethical question of whether that's the way we want elections conducted or whether that's just where we are. Whether or not we want. We've about used our hour, and I want to give the panelists a chance to any last thoughts, extra thoughts that you want to add.
Just to tag on to what we were just talking about, the Democrats invested, one of their top 3 issues was candidate character. So I think at the end of the day, candidate character in abortion mattered. I think that's something we can't ignore. Especially saying that as a pollster, we can talk about how the economy and inflation were at the top of every poll, but it really depends upon how you ask that question. And when you ask about each issue separately, abortion was a very high concern for many voters. And I think we saw that bear out. And I think we saw Democrats do much better in the states where abortion was on the ballot or of concern. And so I think we can't ignore those two big factors as we kind of do a postmortem on this cycle.
I think the thing I'd mention, John, that I'm thinking about as we're looking ahead, and I think we all know we're now looking at 2020, we're all focused on 2024, is for me and the work that we do in our center, really highlighting the importance. The academic literature already speaks to the importance of mobilization and reaching out to folks if you want to encourage them to vote or making it easier for them to vote. So certainly that was the case among young adults. When if young adults are mobilized, they will turn out. And I think it becomes a perpetuating cycle. And so if they continue to turn out, they'll continue to be mobilized. And from my perspective, that's a good thing.
I want to not go down the path that Chris resisted going down of talking about 2024 election yet, but just in closing, are there one or two either newly elected people or re-elected people that any of you are particularly excited about, either positively or mostly positively, think are people you really want to follow and see how they do?
I want to echo and ditto what Chris said about Wes Moore. In thinking about 66 and Reagan emerging as a governor there, perhaps Moore will be that figure for Democrats that emerges out of this somewhat hopeful moment as far as the party is concerned, given what could have happened and was anticipated happening in the midterms. I think Moore is a figure to keep your eye on going forward. I just want to quickly say, remember the Kentucky, I guess Kentucky had a ballot issue, right, related to abortion too. And I think that was an interesting finding as well, that may not be, along with the Kansas legislature earlier, or the vote, I should say earlier, referendum on abortion rights. I think that's an important point to remember coming out of a red state going forward as well.
I'd add, in terms of people to watch, I think one of the interesting things about Tuesday night is, we can talk about red wave and blue wave, but we sort of had competing waves on Tuesday night, depending on which state you're looking. I don't know if they're crashing into each other in this metaphor or what, but the point is, if you look at a state like Florida, where Ron DeSantis had an enormous victory, and at Miami-Dade turning red in Florida is a significant development for that state and for presidential politics potentially in the future as well. And I think you have to talk about, we are talking about, right, Ron DeSantis is a potential presidential candidate. And then by that same token, I think we should be looking more at Michigan, and particularly the job that Gretchen Whitmer did in winning re-election there and being at the top of that ticket, where there really was a blue wave in an important swing state in Michigan. And I think that Gretchen Whitmer, we don't know what's going to happen in 2024 for the Democrats, whether Joe Biden's going to run again. But as we talk about whether it's 24 or 28, who are the future national leaders of the Democratic Party, I think Gretchen Whitmer deserves or should be talked about quite a bit in terms of potential leaders.
And I was just going to mention the three women that I mentioned before as first, our first Latinas, first Black women to represent their state in Congress. So Yadira Caraveo, Delia Ramirez in Illinois, Summer Lee in Pennsylvania. These are also all women who won state legislative races for the first time in 2018. And so as we think about the context of the wave of women in 2018 running for and winning office, particularly young women and women of color, they're now in Congress. And that's a very fast trajectory. And I think will have an effect on the representativeness of the U.S. House.
Okay, well, let me thank you all. Kelly Dittmar, Ashley Koning, Elizabeth Matto, Chris Shields, Saladin Ambar. Thank you all for being here. And those watching at home, thank you very much for tuning in. And sign up for other event notices at Eagleton, and we welcome you to other programs we have on screen and sometimes in person.